We'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. We are located in Cacaronto, known as Toronto in Mohawk, which means where the trees are standing in the water. Today, Cacaronto is covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaty, the traditional territories of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. As we gather here today, these nations continue to experience colonization and displacement, where land acknowledgements are offered in place of land itself. As settlers, newcomers, refugees, and Indigenous peoples, we have all been invited in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We are also mindful of broken treaties that exist across Turtle Island today and recognize our responsibilities as treaty people to engage in meaningful, continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all our relations. And of course, sorry, just having a little technical problem here. I'm just going
While
to.
Nancy sorts that through, I'll just take a moment, Nancy, if it's okay to just ground myself with everyone online. As Max suggested, I'm Michelle Monroe. I am a social worker by training. I am a mother of two incredibly young people who keep me active and engaged, who are in the public education system. I am an aunt and an uncle. I'm an aunt. I'm a cousin of many. And by day, I work with the Toronto District School Board, which is one of our largest district. And during the day, my role is really working with our district around how we embed engagement within the Toronto District School Board. So our conversation today actually comes from years of Nancy and I doing work together within the education system and outside of the system in working with leaders about the way in which they work with our parents and caregivers in leading parent-caregiver engagement. I am intentional with the language about leading parent and caregiver engagement, and particularly leading anti-oppressive parent-caregiver engagement. So the article that we wrote in the book that is now out called Transformative Change Through Educational Leadership actually comes from our experience in doing this work for a very long period of time and talking about how do we embed anti-oppressive work, principles, values in parent-caregiver engagement? How do our leaders think about the ways in which they do the work? And that's when we started thinking about the possibilities of this article. And that's where that chapter came from within that book. Are you ready to go, Nance?
Well, I sure hope so. I apologize. I'm actually going to keep the slides up. Okay, so we would just ask as we go through our presentation that we all seek first with the intent to understand, that we differentiate between opinion and personal antidotes and informed knowledge from data that speaks to the broader group level patterns, that we all accept discomfort as necessary for growth, that you don't have to get it for it to be so, and that we all look to identify our learning edge and push it, expecting and accepting non-disclosure. As Michelle said, a year or two ago, Professor Ken McKinnon from the University of Prince Edward Island was seeking contributors to his book, which he was editing. The purpose of the book was to examine leadership and ways, leadership identity and ways effective leaders are collaborative. And it also looked to examine the importance of leading through a social justice and anti-racist lens. Our work was, we looked at, as Michelle said, how essential it is for parent-caregiver engagement to be grounded in an anti-oppressive stance, that it must challenge traditional systems and structures that perpetuate inequalities and oppression, both in the education systems and in traditional engagement practices. And we look to examine the leader's role in creating and leading an ethos of anti-oppressive engagement. In our chapter, we didn't intend it to be a toolbox for creating anti-oppressive engagement, but to help leaders pull back the curtain on long-held beliefs and practices that often ignore the community and harm students and parents and caregivers. After looking at the work of researchers in the field, we presented 4 examples of practices that we were aware of from our work and offered guidance on moving forward. Today, we want to look at one of those scenarios and the paths leading to anti-oppressive parent engagement. And it's just not going to behave for me. Oh, there we go. First of all, when looking at oppressive and anti-oppressive leadership, we have to recognize the various lenses of oppression that exist, that we view situations and our work through, and to understand when those perceptions that we hold are free from oppression, it allows teachers and leaders to focus on the individual in front of them. So we'd like to begin by doing a little interactive work with you. We would ask you who gave you your name and why, or what is the origin of your name, and how do you feel about your name? And we would ask you to either write your responses to those in the chat or just turn on your mic and tell us. Michelle, you're going to have to follow the chat, I think. I'm not seeing it.
I can see it clearly, Nancy. I'm not seeing anyone who's taken that step yet. Just briefly.
I'll pop in and say hi, everybody. My name's Ramana Siddiqui. So the name Ramana is the origins is Persian. It means pomegranate, which is a fruit that is supposed to be in heaven. Thanks.
Thank you, Ramana. Anyone else?
Nancy, we have Christina who says parents gave her name, Swedish speaking, a Finnish mother, and her name reflects that. I believe is Dani. Dani, please correct me if I've sent it incorrectly. I got my name from a youth activist, in Turkey, who was executed by the conservative government in the 1968. It also means Dani, which I love. Oh, and one name, it means a gift from God. Thank you, everyone, for that. We just wanted to just contextualize that. Go ahead, Nancy.
Thank you. Oh, honestly, Michelle, I think you're going to have to, my computer is, of course, acting up because, oh, here we go. So, as with most of our work, it begins with a story, which I will read to you now. During a parent advisory group meeting, racialized parents and caregivers advised the school leader that all staff, including the leader, have been shortening or anglicizing their children's names. They feel harmed and questioned why it is not being acknowledged and addressed. The leader assures them that the teachers meant no harm and moves on with the meeting. We would ask you to reflect on this story, and again, either in the chat or by turning on your mics. Do you think that the leader's identity impacted their response to the parents and caregivers? And if it did, how did it do? And was the response harmful? And if so, how? Any responses?
No, not yet in the chat.
Okay, anyone?
Yeah, I can pop. I can speak again. So it was pretty dismissive. So I do think that that's harmful. It's not welcoming. It doesn't encourage a sense of belonging. And I do think the fact that it was the leader taking that, like the culture starts from leadership. and comes down. So clearly then it's embedded all the way to the top. So that there needs to be a cultural shift.
Thank you.
We do have a comment in the chat where it states it is demeaning to have your name changed without agreement.
Thank you. So the leader did not understand their own positionality. They were not tuned into their own biases and assumptions, and they engaged in avoidance, not wanting to address an issue that was brought up that they didn't agree with or didn't see as important. And by doing that, almost engaged in accusations of the parent community that what they were seeing and feeling wasn't really happening and wasn't valid. This, in turn, became re-traumatizing for the parents and caregivers and for their children, who would go on to have their names mispronounced or anglicized. And I would posit that it may also have had an effect that those people who were sitting at the table whose children hadn't experienced this were not aware that it was going on, and how they positioned what was happening within their own biases and assumptions. So how do we create an ethos? Michelle?
So our conversation in the chapter about creating the ethos is looking at these 4 key areas. We talk about self-inquiry of the leader. We talk about acknowledging. We talk about disrupting and dismantling. And we talk about constructing or reconstructing our spaces. Next slide. So with self-inquiry, I want to begin with a quote from Dr. Yolanda Sealy-Ruiz. She talks a lot about the importance of leaders ensuring that we're engaging in work that allows us to do individual, deep root, peel back the layers of ourselves to be able to explore how issues of race, class, faith, gender, orientation actually lives within us. And in order to lead in a way that is anti-oppressive, we've got to be able to identify where those things sit within ourselves. We know that we all hold biases. We don't know the types and the extent of which we hold it until we do that individual work that allows us to do that archaeology, which many of us would understand meaning just a deep dig, that we're peeling back the layers of ourselves on a regular basis to be sure that we're actually checking where we sit in our positions on these issues as leaders when we're working with parents and caregivers and students and educators across our districts. We should also be ensuring that we're also naming these things in individual ways for ourselves and being able to accurately present and do self-work. And what we mean by self-work is what we don't know we seek, and that we're not always looking to those groups to provide us with what we need, but we're doing our independent work to ensure that as we're identifying, we're building and creating. Next slide, Nancy. The next is acknowledging. And the acknowledging for us is anti-oppressive leaders must recognize that our systems are not neutral. We talk a lot in education about neutral learning. And what we know is that there is no neutrality in education. We know that isms, racism, sexism, ableism, all this extent of it actually exists within our system. But sometimes we approach it, whether it be curriculum, whether the way we engage with students, whether we engage with our parents and caregivers in our communities, we have a tendency to engage like it is all neutral, that we don't have systems that limit, manage, control how particular parents and guardians may connect to engage in our system. And so it's important that as a leader, we're able to actually acknowledge that it exists, because we can't shift or change what we're not willing to acknowledge. You know, so I usually say when I'm working with leaders, when I hear language like, this is how we've always done it, and we've done this forever in this way, that's not acknowledging that there may be deeply rooted systems that are blocking and actually oppressing particular community, parents, caregivers, audience from engaging and participating, whether in our schools or our local districts. So we've got to also recognize that some of our policies and procedures are very Eurocentric. And the principles of values are grounded in Eurocentricity. And so when we have parents who comes from various parts of the world, who speak various languages, who engage in various faith practices that may not align with those Eurocentric principles, we do tend to run into challenges on a daily basis, where because of what we have structured and what we're not willing to acknowledge, we have a tendency then of saying to those who are entering, this is who we are and this is how we do business, and there we're expecting you to adjust. And the question about the adjustment or changes is, does that work to uplift and support and nurture cultures of environment where all your parents and caregivers are able to actually engage meaningfully within your school or district? Next slide. The next area we're going to talk about is disrupt and dismantle. And we believe in this area, this just really seeks to that a leader must seek to identify, challenge, and interrupt those practices and behavior that perpetuate oppression. So if I may go back to the scenario we talked about, the story Nancy mentioned, that is an example of an everyday practice that provides leaders, teachers, the opportunity to disrupt oppression when it's taking place. So in this school meeting, in this scenario, you had a group of parents in a larger meeting, which is surrounded by a variety of parents and caregivers. And these parents brought this issue forward, which then provided the leader with the space and the opportunity to hear, acknowledge, affirm, and build up. What happened was the opposite. And I want to be clear that the leader may not have intentionally thought that they were doing harm, but we've got to keep in mind oppression is not about intent, it's about the impact. And so that leader may have perceived that that response was simply based on a confidence in staff or fully awareness and not a recognition that response would have done harm. But the fact is the harm was done. And in that space, what we want to be doing is ensure that when these come up in our everyday daily practices, that we're disrupting it in those spaces. So I would have considered this a public space where there were a variety of parents and caregivers, some who may have identified as non-dominant or dominant, or racialized or non-racialized. And it was an opportunity for the leader in that space to acknowledge, but instead the response that came was one that actually isolated, further marginalized, and I dare say harmed those students and the parents and caregivers in that space. So when we talk about disrupting, we're simply saying we have everyday moments and opportunities as we move throughout our schools, move throughout our districts where these things are happening. And it's essential that we're actually addressing them in that moment, in that space, right? The disrupting is in that scenario where the leader could have simply, an alternative response in that scenario could have simply been something along the line of, tell me a bit more about what you're hearing from your students and help me to understand a bit more of what that harm looks like. And that listening was would have been one of the essential areas in that. And the next simple response would have been, thank you for relaying this to me. I will take it back to the staff and we can have an in-depth conversation about this in our meetings and figure out where our staff is and what is required. Because the reality is, it's not the perception of the leader. It's about the impact of it on the students and the parents and caregivers within that space, which require us to actually take that back and do some work around that. The other thing we talk about with disrupting is amplification of voices. And what we simply mean by that, if I go back to this scenario again, that the leader had the opportunity to center the voices of that audience and allow them to speak more and inform and educate that larger space about what that experience is for them. So there's a learning and opportunity that could have taken place where those who are not aware of the harm or the importance of names or how significant names are to identities and who we are, to learn a bit about what that meant, and then turn it into a teaching and learning space for not just those parents, but the others, but also the leadership that was in that space, and bring value to those voices, right? And to ensure that it is heard. And so disruption is about that amplification. The last thing I'm going to highlight on this is being an ally. And I'm going to simplify allyship in always center the impacted, listen and learn from those who live in oppression, leverage the privilege we hold. And in that particular scenario, the principal held a lot of power and privilege. They had the power and the authority in that space, how that conversation could not have happened, and had, I think, the responsibility to leverage a privilege and also yield the floor. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, would you go back for a quick second?
Yes, sorry.
I use that's all right. When I say dismantle, dismantling for me is once you've disrupted, you have to take action to change it. Lots get concerned when we use the language. Michelle, dismantling sounds so, what would you say, Nancy? You've said it to me that it sounds harsh. Some may receive it as differing because dismantling suggests, Michelle, you're tearing everything down and rebuilding it, right? And what we're proposing in this space is that you've got to intentionally change practices, policies, and procedures. That's what I'm being intentional about dismantling, right? So where you may have a practice that's harming, you've got to intentionally in this space. So if I go back to this example again, dismantling that would have been for me, the principal, after leaving those parents, entering into dialogue with staff, that's intentional, that talks about what was heard, that provides education about what it means to do harm and the importance of names, providing spaces that talks about what is acceptable and unacceptable, speaking of safe spaces for parents and caregivers and students, but I also dare say setting standards. Clear standards of what is acceptable and unacceptable in our school, in our district, and in our culture. And to be sure that then you're putting in place, what do we do to ensure that this does not happen again? But also importantly, that every student that moves through our classrooms or schools, every parent caregiver that we interact with, that we're ensuring that we're creating spaces that are safe for them, that's not further re-traumatizing or harming. Next slide. Which takes us, after we've done that, then we're thinking you need to begin to move to the space of reconstructing and constructing spaces that identify, challenge, and dismantle these practices, right? And I said earlier about that we leverage our power as leaders by taking steps and taking proactive steps in making changes. So if it's a practice that we see needs to be changed, we're taking proactive steps intentionally by saying and offering what kind of professional development is required in our space. Who do we do this professional development for? Where is our audience? If it's our teachers, where are they, or leaders in our schools? Where are they in understanding this work of oppression and anti-oppression? And how do we ensure that we're providing the appropriate tools and resources for this to happen? It's an analysis of policies and procedures as well. And I recognize this can happen at the school and also district level. What do we have in place? What are our policies and procedures saying about safety and equity and 2S LGBTQ and racism and oppression? What do we have in place? What are some of the principles that we've set that the audiences in which we serve are understanding what their rights and access are, but also that our staff are aware of what their responsibilities are in ensuring that we're doing this work to support. We need to create greater efficacy and impact by connecting with the groups and amplifying their voices. So we don't want to be doing this work in silo. We want to be doing this work in collaboration. I believe when I sat in on the conversation with Anne Ishmaru, who also did one of this, she spoke well of that. She spoke about the importance of us ensuring that we're hearing those voices, that we don't move forward with our work without including those communities in helping us designing, what do those policies look like? What does our practice look for? And we do that by centering them in our decision-making practices. In education, I know we operate a lot on expertise. And in the work of engagement, we talk a lot about each stakeholder bring various expertise into the space. And in this area of work, we need to recognize the layer of expertise and the knowledge that our parents and caregivers bring in helping us establish policies and procedures, and understanding that their lived experiences are so essential and valuable in us being able to do this, and us creating the work to do this in a way that brings our educators, our parents and caregivers in our community to one space. So we're doing this meaningfully. The essential piece about bringing that audience into the space is also buying in validity. We don't want to be working and moving forward in areas that are going to impact our audience that we've not connected them to. So it's really essential that we take the time. And I know that's not always the fastest process, but I think there's a quote out there that says sometimes in order to go quickly, we have to go slowly. Next slide, Nancy. So the key message for us in the article is that we need to be beginning to moving in an anti-oppressive way of leading. And I fully recognize that depending on where we are in the world, this is not an easy thing to do. In an environment now that's become so divisive, I always say in my training that we're in a period where I think is one of the most challenging times that we've been in, particularly in the issues of equity and anti-oppression work, and languages that I'm hearing about whether you're too woke or not too woke. But in the field of education, it is so essential that we're using an anti-oppressive lens in our leadership, particularly when recognizing that we're dealing with an audience that comes to us with various knowledge and experience and value that can help us move this field along. And we can't do this if we don't take a look at ourselves and be aware of where our biases are, and have a recognition that our environment has socialized us, and that our positionality, who we are, what we see, and how we see things is embedded in our lived experiences, and that we're called upon at times to check it, and ensuring that every time we're doing this work, that it's ongoing, that I don't just do a one equity workshop or a DEI session and I'm good, that this is a constant archaeology of ourselves to do anti-oppressive work and anti-oppressive leadership. And we can't do that if we're not willing to speak truth of we live and work in an educational environments that are not always open, that are not equitably, that are not accessible, that in some spaces actually present barriers for our audience to engage. And that we've got to be willing to step out, and we've got to be willing to disrupt oppression when we see it and where we see it, and be able to say we need to do better and we need to do differently, because our students, and I dare say our students' lives, and sometimes the lives and the mental health of the well-being of their parents and caregivers requires us to do that type of leadership.